To prejudge someone on the color of their skin, their physical features, the neighborhood where they live, or who they associate with is profiling, pure and simple. It's a way that in society we create a hierarchy of sorts that divides people on a scale of good to bad based on their skin color or their physical features. On this Truthout Interviews, I welcome freelance journalist and contributor to Truthout, Bethania Markus, who has penned a piece on Truthout that examines the way in which media outlets subtly and not so subtly reinforce racial hierarchies here in the United States and abroad. Bethania, welcome to Truthout Interviews.
Thank you.
So you start with an example in your article of People magazine. We've all seen it on the newspaper stands. Celebrities are on there, by and large, to get people to open up the magazine. And the celebrity that was featured in this edition of People magazine that you talk about in your article is Paula Deen. And Paula Deen is this person who has gone through her own travails. She had a bit of a slip up, if you will, maybe not so much of a slip up, but the way in which she talks about race, that she admitted that she used the N-word very freely in her conversations. On that cover there's a juxtaposition of another story of a man named George Stinney who was wrongly convicted of a murder and executed. And it was about his family. Now, maybe you could talk about that sort of odd juxtaposition of Paula Deen and George Stinney a little bit and how it relates to racial hierarchy or racism in this country.
It wasn't just the fact that they were together in the cover. It was also the fact that the way that the Paula Deen story was written is written in a way that makes it sound like she had undergone a scandal and she was trying to take her life back or whatever term they used after a scandal. But what she had done, what she admitted to doing, and a scandal is like, you cheated on your taxes and you got caught, or like you cheated on your husband and you got caught, or you did something that was nefarious and you got caught and there's a scandal. But she was participating in a system that was oppressing an entire race of people. And she admitted to using the N-word, which, some people will say, okay, in the South at that time, that wasn't uncommon, but I don't buy that as an excuse because it was well known that that word was a derogatory word that was used as a way of devaluing human beings as human beings because of the color of their skin. So even if you lived in the 1960s or 1950s in the South, I would think that if you were concerned for and considered African Americans your equal, you wouldn't be using that word, even though it was common. People used it and it was common because racism was common. They didn't acknowledge any sort of overlap between the two stories. And there is an overlap because George Stinney was a 14-year-old child who was basically accused of murder. He was convicted, arrested and convicted in a very short time period. I mean, the trial was like a travesty. It's been called, basically like a legal lynching. His family was chased out of town. He didn't have any access to his parents. He was convicted within a matter of, I think, hours in his trial by a jury of all white men. There was no evidence presented against him. And, within 2 months, he was executed in a really horrific way. And he was the youngest person ever executed by the state in the 20th century.
And you said that in the article that when he was electrocuted, he was in the electric chair, but he was because of his small frame, or that he was basically a child, that something happened. Was he set on fire?
When they buried him, there was an open casket, and they said that his remains were charred. And there's a newspaper report, apparently. There's not a lot of documentation remaining from that case, but apparently there's a newspaper account that said because he was too small for the electric chair, they were shocking him and he wasn't dying. So they wrapped a towel around his head, which caught fire.
So People magazine talked about this story, about the family members of George Stinney, and was it evidence that had come out about the trial and the eventual execution of him, or that he was wrongly convicted? I'm not sure the actual angle of the story about what they were taking.
His family is now just basically trying to clear his name because he didn't get a fair trial. There's no doubt about that, and they say that he's innocent of any crime.
And so here you have this story of a young boy who was convicted of a murder and executed in a pretty horrific way. And he gets the small box in the corner. And, who gets the main picture is Paula Deen. And she's trying to portray, or at least People magazine is trying to portray her as somebody who is trying to learn from her mistakes to try to overcome this scandal. Well, it's not really, as you put it, it's not really a scandal about what happened. She brought it on herself.
They kind of portrayed her as this victim who had gone through all this terrible stuff. And, the stuff that she went through, I mean, I'm sure it was very personally uncomfortable for her, but it's absolutely nothing like being discriminated against because of the color of your skin, and, the New York Times actually went back and talked to one of her former colleagues, a woman that was key in basically helping her launch her empire. She's an African-American woman named Dora Charles. And Dora Charles told the Times that, there's a lot of, she used racial slurs, but not just that. She was accused of, having her Black employees dress up in Aunt Jemima outfits and ringing dinner bells and all of this like really troubling stuff. And the lawsuit deposition, she had actually admitted to fantasizing about what amounted to like this plantation style wedding reception. So it was about more than she just, I used the N-word back in the day. It was about a lot more than that. And they didn't acknowledge that in this story.
She reimagines or idealizes plantation life and thinks, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had people dressed up like this at a wedding reception, ringing dinner bells and bringing back plantation life? And that sort of romanticized view of what plantation life is really twisted. This sort of dovetails into my next question, and it's something that, when you were talking about Paula Deen, reminds me of a lot of something that you talked about in your article. And then there's a kind of a persecution complex that whites feel is directed at themselves. Whether it's the legacy of slavery, whether it's the legacy of overt racism in this country where there was separate and equal, or just the not so subtle racism that goes on every day. And I do see it expressed in the media, but maybe you could talk a little bit about this.
There's a poll that I talked about briefly in the article. Not a poll, but a study that Tufts did, where they basically learned that a lot of whites in this country, and I think it was the majority or close to the majority, if I remember, I don't have it in front of me, but think that they're now victims of racism more than Blacks. I think a lot of white people don't understand that how much of a key racial profiling plays, because they think, well, if you're in prison, it must be because you did something wrong, right? But they don't understand, and I don't think that they really want to understand that maybe they would be in prison if the police stopped them at equal rates that they stop African American people.
Yeah, it's like you could present evidence or facts and say, here are examples that statistically you can show, whether it's prison populations, whether it's people being stopped by police or hauled into jail for minor infractions versus on the scale of Blacks and whites. But people's perception of race, or their feeling like they're being discriminated against, that's the other thing. Like, for example, I didn't get the job because they probably had to give it to an African American. Well, you don't know, right? You have no idea whether that's the case or not. But that's the perception. Politicians build on this. There was, I think it was either Jesse Helms who had run a campaign ad of just a pair of white hands looking at a job rejection notice and said,
"You needed that job, and you were the best qualified, but they had to give it to a minority because of a racial quota. Is that really fair?" Harvey Gantt says it is. Gantt supports Ted Kennedy's racial quota law that makes the color of your skin more important than your qualifications. You'll vote on this issue next Tuesday. For racial quotas, Harvey Gantt. Against racial quotas, Jesse Helms.
These are not so subtle, but it happens and it gets reinforced to the point where people start to believe, or many whites start to believe that they are the ones that are being persecuted against, that they suffer a kind of racism every day because of whether you didn't get a job, whether you got slighted at the store at some level, whatever. These just sort of subjective things, but you put objective facts and say, look at the numbers, and then you tell me what's racist in the society.
The idea of white victimization is also a very dangerous one because it does actually feed more virulent and more violent forms of racism. Like, I think that if you ask a lot of these, these outright racists, like say the Klan or like the skinheads or whatever, like you ask them, why are you doing what you're doing? And, the response you'll invariably get is some kind of self-defense, the need for self-defense, the feeling of fear, that they're being encroached on, that their rights are being taken away or whatever because of this influx of people of color. If you feel like they're being victimized, then sort of you feel like you need to defend yourself.
You were talking about, or at least you wrote about in your article, about the Boston Marathon bombing last year and the way in which the media was just covering this as, the sort of breathlessness of coverage. And granted, this was a big deal. It was quite a horrific event. But then you talk about a Mother's Day shooting that happened in New Orleans that I think was maybe a week or two later that hardly got any coverage.
There was a writer who wrote for The Guardian about this very thing, basically saying, like, if, these kinds of tragedies that happen, if they happen to white people in a white area, like just the way that the media covers it is different than the way that they cover something that happens in the quote unquote inner city. As horrific as Newtown was, as horrific as the Boston bombing was. I mean, why is it that a parade in New Orleans on Mother's Day that gets shot up and there's fatalities gets less, they don't call it a tragedy or an American tragedy.
Right, and it builds into a narrative that goes beyond the borders of the United States. And we were talking before we started recording, and I mentioned that, if a bomb it goes off in the Middle East and, 10, 20, 30 people die, but you see it almost every day in the newspaper or you see it covered in the news, you start to get conditioned in a way to think, oh, well, that is what happens in that part of the world. If you read about a shooting in the inner city and you see over and over that the media is covering only shootings in the inner city, then you tend to get conditioned to think, well, that's where the violence occurs. So when it's atypical, like Newtown or like Boston, then the media suddenly goes into, overdrive and say, this is, all hell is breaking loose. Society is crumbling.
Yeah. And also, I think that the amount of coverage and the way that they, subtle cues that you probably don't even realize, like the kinds of words that they use to describe situations, I think create these ideas without people really even realizing it. Like, you're going to, if, there's a bombing at the Boston Marathon and it gets 24-hour coverage for 2 weeks, the average person watching is going to assume, okay, this is a major thing, and then if, like you said, if there's a shooting in an area that's predominantly people of color live there predominantly, what it really is placing different values on people's lives based on, their demographic.
The other thing we were talking about prior to recording was that something that I've noticed in the media, especially if white crime is committed, white violent crime is committed, most notably Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombings. I had heard this over and over when people talk about him. Yes, he was part of this group, this militia that blew up this building, but they would often in the same breath say how smart he was. And I've seen this over and over, that when white crime happens, they talk about how intelligent the criminal is. But if it's committed by, say, hijackers who take over an airplane or a couple of airplanes and blow up some buildings in New York, the World Trade Center, they're fanatics. Not to say that these people were intelligent and these people aren't. The crime is horrific, whether it's committed by a white person or somebody from the Middle East. It is a crime. It is a horrific crime. Stop trying to categorize people based on their intelligence. And this is what racism does. It creates this hierarchy. And it's being done in the media when it comes to crime.
One of the cases that stands out in my mind, because I really noticed it, was the way that the media reported, and it's not in my story, but it did catch my attention was the way the media reported the Johnny Lee Lewis murder. I don't know if you remember. He was the actor in The Sons of Anarchy, if I remember correctly, and he was a white man. But what he did was horrible. He bludgeoned his elderly landlady to death. I think she was 83 years old. He dismembered her cat, and then he fell and he died because he fell. He tripped and fell, or he was on drugs, and so he just couldn't stand up or whatever. And the way the media reported it was he was mentally ill. He's a victim, but he's so bright and so talented. And they talked to all his friends, and such a bright guy, but troubled. Troubled. But, just imagine if an African-American man had committed that crime. It was a white man that committed that crime, but just imagine, how they would report that story, the differences in the language that they would use.
They say that he's troubled because he has this record of being on this popular television show. So they almost want to save part of his reputation and say, the work that he did on the show has no relation to this crime that he committed. Certainly it doesn't, but it also shows you that they're trying to almost do a PR offensive to make sure that, well, the white guy that committed the crime, there was something wrong. We needed to look different. If somebody could have intervened at some point, if he had an intervention, things would have been all right. He would have been on the straight and narrow again. But like you said, if it had been an African-American male who had done this, it would have been like, what an animal, what a horrible person, what of this, and a lot of other words that would come out that I don't want to say.
Yeah, and you see that a lot. You see when in the reporting of the crimes of white people, you see not only, okay, we're going to talk about, how smart he was, but we're also going to talk about, how he was mentally ill and how he was troubled and, how he was basically a good person who just had, problems. And, maybe that's true, but why is it that crimes committed by people of color are not given that same sort of sympathetic, description? This is an issue that Ms. Shimaranga brings up a lot of times. Like they'll say somebody has possible gang ties, and that immediately criminalizes them, and it creates this image of, well, sooner or later something bad was going to happen to them, so we can just write that off. They haven't had a trial or anything; they're just being basically slandered. In the media, and it's very common, and it doesn't happen to white people. You never hear of a white person having possible gang ties, So.
It's true. I mean, you could run down a list. If you're African American, you have gang ties. If you're Arab American, you're probably connected to some terrorist organization. If you're Asian, maybe you're connected to the Chinese mafia or something, and you're trying to steal our trade secrets, and it runs down the line. And you see this, and as I said, subtle and not so subtle ways of racially categorizing people, that people don't understand that this is a form of racism. That suddenly, it used to be that if you were Italian or Italian American, that suddenly you had mob ties. I know Mario Cuomo, the former governor of New York, had said that he said, one of the things that I really get tired of is every TV show or movie that has Italian Americans, they always have mob connections. He says, what I'm trying to tell you is not all Italian Americans have mob connections. It's just not true.
Yeah, well, I am myself an Italian American, and it's kind of funny because, I remember being asked in college, like, whether I knew anybody. Somebody wanted to get into the mob, and they were like, do you know anybody that can get me in? And I was like, why would I, But, it's funny. That's kind of, it's sort of an interesting point because it sort of brings up, this artificiality of race, because at one point, Italians weren't considered white. And a lot of immigrants from Europe that were the wrong kind of immigrants from Europe were not considered white. And white just sort of, it doesn't really mean anything other than social standing. It's a made up concept so that you can create a hierarchy. And it means nothing. We're almost all like genetically identical, other than the fact that we have different parents from each other. The way that it's important is social and political, and so how do you enforce, this completely made up system of hierarchy based on something as ridiculous as, your skin color? Once you create that sort of set of assumptions in somebody, then you can create a whole political system, a whole system of oppression, and they're not going to balk at that, because it sort of ties into what they believe, even though they may not even know or really admit like what their assumptions are.
And we're going to leave it there. Bethania, I want to thank you so much for being on Truthout Interviews.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
You can read Bethania's piece on Truthout, share it with your social networks, and subscribe to Truthout Interviews by clicking the box up in the corner here in the screen. And that's Truthout Interviews for another week. I'm Ted Asregadoo. Thanks for watching.